Hi everyone, welcome back to our Truth File channel, where forgotten American history finally comes alive. Today, we're diving deep into America's first software engineers were women, a story that rewrites everything we thought we knew about our beginnings. During World War II, the United States military faced a critical problem that threatened to undermine the entire war effort. Artillery was becoming increasingly sophisticated and calculating the firing tables, the charts that told gunners what angle and charge to use for different distances and conditions, was taking far too long. Each trajectory calculation required solving complex differential equations, and a single firing table could contain thousands of these trajectories. A skilled human computer working with a desktop calculator needed approximately 40 hours to calculate just one trajectory. The Army's Ballistic Research Laboratory at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland was drowning in backlog. The military recruited dozens of women mathematicians to work as human computers. These women, many of them recent college graduates with degrees in mathematics, sat at desks with mechanical calculators, crunching numbers day after day. But even with this workforce, they couldn't keep pace with the military's needs. The Army needed a faster solution, and they believed the answer lay in a revolutionary new machine being developed at the University of Pennsylvania's Morse School of Electrical Engineering. The Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, known as ENIAC, was conceived as a solution to this computational crisis. When completed, it would be the first general-purpose electronic digital computer. But ENIAC was more than just fast. It was a completely new kind of machine. It weighed 30 tons, contained 17,468 vacuum tubes, 7,200 crystal diodes, 1,500 relays, 70,000 resistors, and 10,000 capacitors. It consumed 150 kilowatts of electricity and filled a room measuring 30 by 50 feet. When turned on, it reportedly dimmed the lights in an entire section of Philadelphia. The hardware engineers working on ENIAC, John Markley and J. Presper Eckert, received significant recognition and funding. But someone needed to figure out how to make this massive machine actually solve the Army's problems. That's where 6 women came in: Kay McNulty, Betty Snyder, Marlin Westcoff, Ruth Lichterman, Frances Billas, and Betty Jean Jennings. If you're amazed by our ancestors' story, America's first software engineers were women, our goal on this video is to get 500 likes. Drop a comment about your favorite fact and subscribe to join the Truth File channel. These women were selected from the pool of human computers working at Aberdeen. They had proven themselves as exceptional mathematicians, capable of complex calculations and logical thinking. But what they were about to undertake had never been done before. They were being asked to program a computer, except the concept of programming didn't really exist yet. There were no programming languages, no instruction manuals, no courses they could take, no experts they could consult. The word software hadn't even been invented. When the women first arrived at the Morse School in 1945, they were given only the logical diagrams of ENIAC, massive blueprints showing how the machine's circuits were connected. They had to teach themselves how the machine worked by studying these diagrams and examining the physical hardware. Betty Snyder later recalled that they would spread the diagrams out on the floor and trace the circuits with their fingers, trying to understand how data would flow through the machine. The women had to think in an entirely new way. ENIAC wasn't programmed with code typed on a keyboard. That technology didn't exist yet. Instead, programming ENIAC meant physically rewiring the machine. It had 40 plug boards, each containing hundreds of sockets. The women had to determine which cables to plug into which sockets to create the pathways that would make the machine perform the desired calculations. They also had to set thousands of switches to the correct positions. Betty Snyder and Kay McNulty became so attuned to ENIAC that they could diagnose problems by listening to the machine. ENIAC made various clicking and humming sounds as it operated, and the women learned to recognize when something was wrong just from the sounds. They could predict when a vacuum tube was about to fail based on subtle changes in the machine's noise pattern. The women also recognized the need for documentation. They created detailed guides explaining how to program ENIAC, complete with diagrams and examples. These were essentially the first software manuals ever written. They understood that as more people began working with the machine, they would need clear instructions and reference materials. When ENIAC was publicly unveiled on February 14, 1946, it was a sensation. Newspapers across the country ran stories about this electronic brain that could calculate faster than any human. The demonstration showed ENIAC calculating a trajectory in 20 seconds, a task that took a human computer 40 hours. The press called it a giant brain and marveled at its speed and capabilities. But the 6 women who had made ENIAC work, who had invented the entire field of programming, were barely mentioned. The public announcement focused on the hardware engineers and the military officials who had funded the project. When reporters toured the facility, the women were present, but they were often mistaken for models or clerical staff. Some newspapers published photos of the women standing next to ENIAC, but the captions identified them only as women operators or didn't identify them at all. The official celebration dinner for ENIAC's completion didn't include the women programmers. They weren't invited. The event honored the hardware engineers, the military brass, and university officials, but the 6 people who had actually made the machine useful were excluded. This erasure continued for decades. Computer science textbooks told the story of ENIAC as a hardware achievement. When programmers were mentioned at all, they were treated as minor footnotes, technicians who simply operated the machine according to instructions from the real engineers. The women's names disappeared from the historical record. There were several reasons for this systematic erasure. First, programming was initially viewed as clerical work, similar to typing or operating a telephone switchboard. In the 1940s and 1950s, there was a rigid hierarchy in technical work. Hardware engineering was considered prestigious. It required university degrees in engineering and involved sophisticated mathematical and physical principles. Programming, on the other hand, was seen as less intellectually demanding. It was viewed as a matter of following instructions and paying attention to details, skills associated with women's work. This perception wasn't accidental. Grace Hopper, another pioneering computer programmer, later explained that companies deliberately classified programming as clerical work to justify paying women less. If programming was just a form of operation, then programmers could be paid clerical wages rather than engineering salaries. The gendering of programming had profound effects on who got credit for innovations. When programming was seen as low-status work, women were allowed and even encouraged to do it. But as computers became more powerful and programming became recognized as intellectually demanding work requiring sophisticated skills, men began entering the field in greater numbers. By the 1960s and 1970s, companies started actively recruiting men into programming roles and developing professional cultures that excluded women. The historical narrative changed accordingly. Histories of computing began emphasizing male pioneers and treating early women programmers as anomalies or exceptions. The ENIAC programmers, who had literally invented software engineering, were written out of textbooks and museum exhibits. For nearly 40 years, the story of the ENIAC programmers was largely forgotten. The women themselves moved on to other projects and careers. Some continued working in computing. Betty Snyder married John Holberton and became a pioneering programmer who helped develop the COBOL programming language. Others left the field entirely, facing the same barriers that many women in technical fields encountered in the post-war decades. Then, in the 1980s, a computer scientist named Catherine Kleiman was working on a project about women in computing. She came across a photograph from the ENIAC dedication that showed several women standing near the machine. The caption didn't identify them, and Kleiman wondered who they were. She began researching and was shocked to discover that these women had been ENIAC's programmers, and that their contributions had been almost completely erased from history. Kleiman spent years tracking down the surviving ENIAC programmers and documenting their stories. She conducted extensive interviews, gathered archival materials, and worked to bring their achievements to public attention. What she discovered was a story far more significant than anyone had realized. These 6 women hadn't just operated ENIAC, they had invented fundamental concepts of computer programming. They had created techniques and approaches that would become the foundation of software engineering. In 1997, the women were finally inducted into the Women in Technology International Hall of Fame. It was their first major recognition, coming more than 50 years after their groundbreaking work. The honor helped spark wider interest in their story, and gradually more recognition followed. The story of the ENIAC programmers reveals something profound about how innovation happens and who gets credit for it. We tend to think of technological progress as the work of individual genius inventors, people like Thomas Edison or Steve Jobs. But most innovation actually happens through collaborative effort, with many people contributing crucial insights and skills. The ENIAC programmer's story shows how contributions from women and other marginalized groups have been systematically undervalued and erased. It also challenges our assumptions about what counts as real technical work. The hardware engineers who built ENIAC did extraordinary work. They created revolutionary technology using the cutting-edge electronics of their time. But the machine was useless without the software that made it perform useful tasks. The programmers had to solve problems that were just as difficult and intellectually demanding as any hardware challenge. They had to think abstractly, breaking complex problems down into logical steps. They had to understand both mathematics and engineering. They had to be creative, inventing new techniques because no prior solutions existed. The ENIAC programmer's story also illuminates how gender bias has shaped the technology industry. Programming became a high-status, male-dominated field not because men were naturally better at it, but because of deliberate decisions about hiring, education, and professional culture. When programming was seen as low-status clerical work, women were welcomed. When it became recognized as prestigious and lucrative, barriers were erected to exclude them. This history has lasting effects today. Women remain underrepresented in computer science and software engineering. Many factors contribute to this, but the loss of institutional memory about women's foundational contributions is significant. When young women don't see themselves reflected in the history of computing, when they're told implicitly or explicitly that programming is for boys, it affects their choices and aspirations. The ENIAC programmers themselves tried to address this in their later years. Kay McNulty, who died in 2006, spent her final decades speaking to students and young women about her experiences. She wanted people to know that women had been there from the beginning, that they had the skills and creativity to excel in computing. Betty Holberton, who died in 2001, continued working in computer science throughout her life and became an advocate for including women in technology today. There's growing recognition of the ENIAC programmers' contributions. Our ancestors' stories don't end here. They're just waiting to be rediscovered. Smash that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to join the Truth Files channel for the next epic chapter of our forgotten history.